So it's going to be more than 7 months before the first votes are counted in the 2020 presidential nominating contests. But President Trump is already focusing on Joe Biden, while the former vice president is also centering his attention on Trump. Both were in Iowa yesterday, where Biden delivered a scathing set of remarks at stops across the state, as the president lobbed his own barbs both on his way to Iowa and during an appearance in Council Bluffs.
Our politicians let other countries push us around, treat us badly, treat our country with no respect. And you see that with Biden. We would never be treated with respect, because people don't respect him. Even the people that he's running against, they're saying, where is he? What happened?
In 2020, we not only have to repudiate Donald Trump's policies and values, we have to clearly and fully reject, for our own safety's sake, his view of the presidency. Quote, "I have complete power." No, you don't, Donald Trump. Quote from Donald Trump, "I have absolute power." No, you don't, Donald Trump. Or, "Only I can fix it." Fix yourself first, Donald Trump.
He makes his stance in Iowa once every 2 weeks, and then he mentions my name 74 times in one speech. I don't know. That reminds me of Crooked Hillary. She did the same thing. And then when it came time to vote, they all said, you know, she doesn't like Trump very much, but what else does she stand for? Same thing's happening with Sleepy Joe. I'd rather run against, I think, Biden than anybody. I think he's the weakest mentally. And I like running against people that are weak mentally. I think Joe is the weakest up here. The other ones have much more energy. I have to tell you, he's a different guy. He looks different than he used to. He acts different than he used to. He's even slower than he used to be.
The president today raised questions about your age. He raised questions about whether you had the stamina to run for president. There's been a lot of questions about your schedule and that it's been a little lighter than some of the other candidates.
Look at him and look at me and answer the question.
You answer the question. Will you please answer the question?
It's self-evident. You know it's a ridiculous assertion on his part. But anyway, look, people have a right to question all of our ages. That's a totally legitimate thing. And all I can say is watch me.
You know, what did Heilman and others say, that everything Donald Trump says is either a confession or a projection?
Yeah,
Donald Trump is talking about not being the same person anymore, not being as quick as he was before. We actually know that 5 years ago, Donald Trump was a far different person than he is right now. You go back and you look at clips, well, heck, from the late 80s, from the late 90s, a completely different person. And so now he's trying to turn things around and say that Joe Biden is acting differently. Well, let me say this. Regardless of this back and forth, I think what matters right now and what's bothering Donald Trump the most right now are these polls, these head-to-head matchups that show that he's getting absolutely blistered by everybody in the field. We had a story in the New York Times yesterday talking about how he asked his pollster to lie about their internal polls showing him losing. Here we've got a Quinnipiac poll that shows him getting absolutely trounced by Joe Biden, absolutely trounced by Bernie Sanders, getting beaten by 8 points from Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren beating him by 7 points, Mayor Pete beating him by 5 points, as well as Cory Booker beating him by 5 points. Guy Cecil, let me bring you in because you know more about the upcoming 2020 race than anybody I've spoken with. And you say, regardless of these polls, regardless of whatever you hear on TV, this is going to be a close race, most likely to the very end. Talk about what you've seen in the states that matter most: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida, North Carolina, all the swing states.
Well, first of all, as someone that lived through 2016, the idea that we are talking about polls is a little bit nerve-wracking this early in the election cycle. But yes, it's going to be a close election. I mean, our own public projections out of Priority show that if the election were held today, that the Democratic nominee would get 279 electoral votes, and we need 270. So we expect a razor-close margin. And when you look at Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, and Pennsylvania, the election is much closer. You know, the other thing about what's happening between Donald Trump and Joe Biden is the person that benefits most from this is Joe Biden. For this very reason, the fact that we're talking about the two of them really does block out a lot of the other candidates that are running for president on the Democratic side. And I think what you see so far in these early polls, both with the general election and within the primary, is that there are two types of candidates that are doing really well at the top of the ticket. The first are those that have a high name ID that most of the American people know. And the second are those candidates that have been really clear and concise about why they're running. If you ask Pete Buttigieg or Elizabeth Warren in 30 seconds, in 2 minutes, in 30 minutes, tell us why you're running for president, they could do it. And so I think what you're seeing at the top of the ticket right now is a crowding of those people that the American people know well, and those that have done a reasonably good job, particularly in the last, say, 4 to 6 weeks, of laying out why they want to run for president.
So, Guy, what do Democrats have to do, from everything that you have seen, to cut into Donald Trump's leads in places like Kenosha, Wisconsin, Macomb County, Michigan, Youngstown, Ohio, Scranton, Pennsylvania? That seems, in the more rural areas surrounding the I-4 corridor, areas that you and I know very much, know a lot about. What do Democrats have to do to turn the tide and get the people that voted for Barack Obama 8 years ago, but voted for Donald Trump in 2016? How do Democrats get him back on their sides next year? Well,
and I think there's actually even a particular subset of that vote. The fact of the matter is there are actually people that, for example, in Wisconsin voted for Donald Trump and then voted for Tammy Baldwin. There are people in Pennsylvania that voted for Donald Trump and then went on to vote for the Democrat in the Senate race there. And so there are voters that are willing to be open or receptive to a Democratic message. And frankly, the same things that we should be talking to Democratic voters about are the same things we should be talking to folks in Youngstown about. We should be talking about health care. We should be talking about wages. We should be talking about economic opportunity. We should be talking about education. The more we talk about those issues, about how we create more economic opportunity for the middle class and for those that aspire to be in it, the better we're going to do. You know, there's a huge disconnect among the American people between how they view Donald Trump's economy versus whether or not they think that economy is having an impact on their lives. And so when you see polls that say 50, 55, 60% of Americans approve of the way Donald Trump is handling the economy, those same polls say that 70% of Americans don't believe that their wages will keep up with the cost of living or the rising cost of health care. We saw how to beat Republicans. We did it in 2018 on health care, and we can do it again in 2020 if we focus on health care and wages. And I want to just re-emphasize this point. It's not just about getting those voters that voted for Obama and then voted for Donald Trump. There are Democratic voters that sat on the sidelines in 2016 because Democrats did not do a good job of talking about the economy, wages, health care, and education on a consistent basis in a way that the American people were ready to hear. And I think if we focus on those things, we'll ultimately be successful in the 4 states that get the most attention today: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Florida.
And a lot of these candidates already are doing just that, talking about jobs and the economy and inequality. Karine, to go back to Donald Trump's criticism of Joe Biden about age, we can kind of put that to the side, but the larger question is a generational one. When you look at a party that views itself as the sort of the woke party, a new generation of leadership, you look at the top of all the polling, you have Joe Biden, who would be 78 years old, a white man. You have Bernie Sanders, who would be 78 years old if he were to win, a white man. And then you go down the list, of course, you have Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Mayor Pete, Senator Cory Booker. You have some new faces and some younger generational leadership there. How does the Democratic Party grapple with that its front runner does not perhaps necessarily represent that new generation of leadership and the new view of the world?
Yeah, I think Guy laid it out pretty well, Willie. I mean, look, he said that we're looking at a race right now that is pretty much in two tiers. And what I mean by that, and what he said was, you have the first two who are, it is pretty much name ID. People know Joe Biden, as we have talked about, Vice President, very Uncle Joe, very kind of in a very nostalgic way of the Obama days. And you have Bernie Sanders, who ran a very incredible race in 2016. And people remember that political revolution. And then you have kind of the younger crowd that you're talking about, Willie, who are talking about their vision, who are talking about how they're going to move this country forward, in particular Pete Buttigieg, who's the youngest of them all. And then they're starting to surge along with Elizabeth Warren, who's talking about policy. So it's really still very early, and we're seeing some movement there. But I got to tell you, Joe Biden was given a gift yesterday by Donald Trump. I mean, he got exactly what any Democratic candidate would want, is a one-on-one in a general election with the man that you're trying to beat. And Donald Trump gave him that gift. But we have to be careful. Like I said, it's early. It's not a general election. There's primary. We have a large field with really impressive people and diverse. And one more thing I want to say that I haven't heard that I fear, that I'm really scared about, is Donald Trump is a desperate man. He knows that he is individual one, an unindicted co-conspirator. He knows that, and many people have said, but the federal prosecutors, both Democrats and Republicans, have both said that if he wasn't president of the United States, he would be indicted right now. And so when you have a desperate individual like Donald Trump going into 2020, that's a scary, scary moment for us that's coming up in 2020. And he has a better operational campaign than he had in 2016. He has more than $100 million. He raised tens of millions of dollars during the midterms, which is unprecedented for a president to do. And so it is going to be a tight election in 2020, and it's going to be incredibly nasty.
Karine, let me counter that, though. He may be a desperate man. He may be frightening to some, but he's also very damaged. Yeah, and you can see it in his behavior. You can see it in his physical, what he puts out physically. Also, you know, the first time around, no one knew how to deal with him because no one knew what was coming. I mean, some of the stuff that he would say was just so out there that people were just caught flat-footed because no one has ever seen anything like it before. We have been dealing with this guy for years now. People are tired of it. People are tuning it out. People want to see the punch back. It's a different landscape for him. It's a lot scarier than it used to be.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.